Jackal Among Snakes. Author, Nemorosus. Chapter 181, Flower in the Wetlands. With Argrave tapping into the power of his black blood with the use of blood magic, what was a pitched battle quickly inverted in their favor. Argrave had a keen aim, and the constant biting of pain distracted him none. Indeed, it only sharpened his focus, tuning him like an instrument to be dead set on his task at every second. He seldom missed. There were too many targets. Argrave advanced alone, leaving the protection of his companions to give him a better vantage point. He knew the tricks of these sentinels. Even if they were fast enough to attack, he was more than able to guard and dispatch them. Yet few did manage that, and he slaughtered the malformed animals one after another. Something grabbed onto his arm, and he very nearly retaliated before he recognized that it was Annalise. He dispelled the waning cycle blood moon, the thread dissipating into nothing. She dragged him back, shouting something, but his ears were ringing terribly and he could discern nothing. He tried to advance back onto the front lines, but Annalise stopped him, repeating something. As the ringing faded, it slowly came into focus. Stay here, stay here, stay here, she said, time and time again. I get it, Argrave finally responded to her. I'm good, he said, half to himself. Let's finish things up, he commanded, getting ready once more. Though he said that, there was little to finish up. With Argrave single-handedly wiping out one side of the bridge, Duran and Gilliman had cooperated ably with Annalise's support to make way on the other. The sentinels were not all annihilated, but they were routed. Argrave could see a great many of the larger beasts retreating to the center of the vast crater of rushing water. The final confrontation would be there, without a doubt. As Argrave glanced around, a voice cut into his thoughts. Remove your glove, Annalise said, the speed of her voice masking her worry. Argrave leaned against an archway adorned with rose-colored leaves. On the bridge they stood, adrenaline slowly fading. Duran collapsed to one knee. He threw his helmet off and held his face as though nauseous, and Gilliman knelt down beside the tribal. The elven vampire cast a glance at Argrave. The vampire's expression was largely hidden beneath his helmet, which covered only his eyes, but Argrave knew that look wasn't worry alone, or, maybe, or so Argrave hoped. Per Annalise's direction, he took off the glove. It stuck to his flesh, and he felt skin tear as it came free. His hand had cracked all along its surface, beginning from his fingers. Blood dripped from these cracks, swelling in tandem with his heartbeat. Argrave rolled up his sleeve. The cracks continued up his wrist, his forearm, past his elbow, stopping just below the shoulder. His whole arm was pale, appearing somewhat dead. Annalise clenched her teeth and locked gazes with Argrave. Then, she held both hands out. She cast the C-rank, Mystic Suture, her hands following along the cracks in his flesh. Blackness appeared along the edges of the wounds, and the flesh itself seemed to sew together without seams. She stood once the last crack had faded in his flesh. The blood loss will still trouble you, Annalise said quietly. That cannot be healed. Not with my magic, at least. You will be anemic for a time, but considering your unique constitution, not as long as most. Argrave rolled down his sleeve and gave her a quiet nod. He tested his arm. Now that the adrenaline was gone, it felt stiff, numb, much like one's fingers when left out in the cold. Thank you, he said, moving away from the archway. I do not like having to do that, but I always will, she returned. She tripped over a root, clearly exhausted, and Argrave caught her before she could fall. With Annalise held in one arm, Argrave called out, "We've bought time. Small break, gather ourselves, and then press to the center." Duran looked up and nodded, then quickly lowered his head again as through the act made him more nauseous. Argrave looked towards the center of the crater, where the jagged bolt of rot marring the beautiful landscape rushing water seemed to strike a target. After the time taken to rest, Argrave and his company proceeded onwards across the wooden platform. His arm regained its mobility after a few dozen minutes, but his whole body felt heavier, sluggish. Barring the sounds of rushing water, the landscape was eerily quiet. The sentinels left alive had made their retreat, and now they were holed up in the center of this place. As they neared, what was in the center was made clearer. One might expect a grandiose palace of sorts, but this was not a place built for man. Indeed, it might have been built before man, but perhaps built was the wrong word. Once, perhaps, a great tree had stood there. Now, there was only a great circular building of rotted black wood, half caved in. Piles and piles of rot and dust lay around this circular building, meshed with masses of disgusting and wax-ridden plant matter. The upper half of the tree had collapsed, and a great log thicker and taller than any skyscraper was buried beneath the ever-rushing waters of this serene place opposite where they had entered. Its fall had destroyed many of the wooden platforms and plants growing atop the serene place. This will be my time to handle things, Argrave looked at Duran pointedly. Defend me as I do things, nothing more, nothing less. Duran did not even muster indignance at being so blatantly signaled. He gave a quiet nod and took a deep breath to steady his hand. He had obviously been affected by the seriousness of the situation. Annalise looked discontented, so Argrave added, "There'll be no blood magic." She nodded, but he could tell his words were not entirely dispelling her sentiments. I scouted ahead. We know what is within. Whenever you are ready. Annalise gestured towards Argrave. Argrave felt trepidation and anticipation both. He took a deep breath and exhaled. Guilliman, he looked to his companion, then stepped ahead without another word. The elven vampire took his place by Argrave's side, great sword held at the ready as they walked forward. Should have brewed those potions we used at the druidic camp, Argrave said, trying to draw upon humor to ease his nerves. Considering your blood, they wouldn't work, Guilliman pointed out. Argrave snorted, keeping his eyes wide and alert. As he neared the vast opening on the rotten stump ahead of them, Argrave triggered the blessing of supersession. That familiar feeling of an ocean welling up within consumed all his thoughts, and the sole thought occupying his mind was his duty. Argrave took steady, even steps into the sanctuary of the god within this vast crater. One hand was held towards the sky, and the spell matrix for electric eel whirled time and time again, sparking constructs dancing up into the air. The other was outstretched, facing the enemy. The first to leap at Argrave was a giant lynx. It came with claws first, a waxbox-ridden stinger shortly behind. Argrave cared not what it was. He saw it move, and he cast a C-rank spell, Wargfire. A maw of flames emerged, catching the lynx in its teeth. The second enemy came, a dragonfly. He met it with a spell of wind. His right hand became a shield, and his left became a sword. He warded away all comers with large, powerful spells, while the left conjured the eels of electricity dancing in the air. When enough had conjured, he would send the prepared attacks towards his enemies. Dozens of the lithe bolts of lightning striking at once left most foes dead, and those that lived still stood at death's door, spasming in agony. What few enemies made it past his shield of spells or his ever-vigilant companions, Argrave dispatched with a spell cast from Garm's eyes. Like this, great or small, all before him fell. What had been a desperate struggle not an hour ago became an overwhelming defeat for the sentinels of this exalted land. Argrave felt himself drifting away into the feeling of overwhelming power in his hands, as he had times before. It was recognizable, now, like a pool beneath his mind, threatening to consume him. He realized there was something more to this ocean of magic, something deeper. His greater mastery of magic enabled him to see that. He wished to look down, using Garm's eyes to see the magic within. But he feared what was there. He feared supersession had more than one meaning. To combat the tugging, the pulling, he conjured images of Orion. The man would shrug these spells off as though they were nothing, then crush Argrave's skull with his bare hand. The thought helped in sobering him. Argrave cast one final spell, then lowered his hands. His breathing was as steady as it was when he had walked in here. Things were quiet, still. Argrave glanced around, paranoid and rattled, power still surging from within him. Dresky the coward is further back, Argrave urged, stepping ahead. While the power still sprung from within him, Argrave pushed past the horde of dead and dying, not even sparing a glance behind. Guilliman kept pace with him, and he heard his companion's footsteps further back. As they moved deeper into the rotten stump, it stopped making sense. They walked for far too long without ever meeting a wall. Argrave was not concerned, but he was disconcerted to experience this place in person. The sound of rushing water filled his ears, growing in intensity until it was a low roar consuming all sound. Argrave's feet met shallow water, and the scenery changed once again. They were in a deep pit washed in sunlight. Vast waterfalls towered above them in a ring, flowing down to the ground. They all formed one giant spring heading to a great blooming flower of pure water. The water shone like emeralds and sapphire, but nothing could be seen within it. A lone figure waited before the great flower, kneeling. Argrave did not waste time to admire things. He stepped forward, the blessing of supersession still surging within him. Both of his hands worked diligently to conjure electric eels, and before long, a great horde of them surged above his head. With every that joined them, his steps grew more confident. The figure turned her head back and stood. It was a woman. She was short and squat. She looked afflicted with jaundice, but Argrave knew she was not. She was one of the swamp folk. One of the last, that is. They were a short, squat people, with colorful yellow-green skin tones and the mostly brown hair. They were technically human, much in the same way Vadaman and the Southron elves were both technically elves despite their drastic differences. One of the plague jester's servants, "Come to put an end to my lady and light," she said, grabbing at her thighs. She pulled free two sticks. Argrave knew what they did, though, and could not call them simple. Dresky's body was malformed. She wore armor made of wood. Parts of her were missing and had been replaced entirely by wood like a puppet patched together with improper materials. She did not look a dangerous foe, certainly no more than those animal abominations they'd just put an end to. But Argrave knew better. On the contrary, "I've come to put an end to the plague jester. To do that, I need Sylvic's help," Argrave explained. Even though he felt this battle was inevitable, he watched for every movement, knowing Dresky's speed. "So let's get this started." Dresky was rattled, but she held her sticks at the ready. Her feet braced, and Argrave's whole party braced in turn. "How do you know us?" a voice echoed throughout the vast waterfalls. Argrave shifted on his feet, shallow water splashing beneath his boots. "What?" he questioned, genuinely surprised. "How do you know us?" The voice came again, doubled in volume. Argrave almost grabbed at his ears. Dresky hesitated to rush forward. Reasons. Argrave said simply, "That's you, Sylvic." No reply came for a time. Then, the blooming flower of water behind Dresky began to spin outwards, fountaining into the shallow water below. As though unraveling, the flower flowed back into the water at their feet, dissipating. And as it faded, a humanoid figure stood there. Though Sylvic could not be called man or woman, it leaned towards the latter. She had a great crown resembling a stag's, but it was made of writhing tree roots, half of which had been afflicted with the waxpox. The left half of her body was like a vibrant tree, surging with dancing liquid lights. Much of its right half was the same. But even more had been rotted away by the disease they'd seen all too much of lately. "You speak truly? You are an enemy of the jester?" Sylvic questioned. Argrave realized when he heard those words that he might have been too fatalistic about the inevitability of this battle. Chapter 182, Spirit of the Wetlands. "I do speak truly," Argrave confirmed, placing his hand to his chest and lowering his head slightly in a display of deference. "I intend to stop the plague jester." The swamp god Sylvic stepped forth, her radiant body glowing with liquid light. When she spoke, her face remained still. Her voice was decidedly feminine. "And you believe one already infected with the rot the plague jester has conjured will be of use to you, my lady and light? Please do not waste words on those present," Dresky said, stepping forth. "They have slaughtered your guardians." "We were attacked first," Durin pointed out, stepping forth in turn to stand beside Argrave. He gazed at Sylvic with distrust. Argrave knew Durin trusted no gods or any faith given what his people had endured at the hands of the vessels. His distrust was wise, or so Argrave believed. Dresky brandished her twin sticks. "Because you do not belong in these hallowed lands. They should be forbidden to all save the servants of my lady and light. But we can enter your sacred land." Argrave spread his hands out. "Because the waxpox has broken your power completely." "The waxpox?" Sylvic repeated as Dresky bristled at Argrave. "No, I see," she followed up after a second, placing the name. "You say my power is broken by what you call the waxpox. It is true. So I ask again, why do you seek my aid against the plague jester? If you believe I lack power, because you can help me motivate someone who has power to act," Argrave explained, remaining still. "I'm sure you've felt his presence in the edges of these wetlands, where one of the fortresses of the invaders once stood," Argrave said, lowering his voice as he spoke. "The one whom the gods of the Serpent Kingdom have given their blessing?" Sylvic questioned, and Argrave nodded. "And what is my role in motivating this human?" "I have no treasures to offer, no artifacts for humans. I am merely an old spirit of the swamps who watches over the fools that would mar this beautiful land." Sylvic spread her wooden arms out, and the liquid light flowed within her body. "My lady and light." Dresky spoke once again. "Even now, this man keeps an attack ready. Please, retreat." "I shall stall," she implored. Argrave gazed at the electric eels still dancing in the skies above. "The man you speak of, his name is Orion, and the last thing that he would want is any treasure you might offer. But the men outside these wetlands are greedy." Sylvic tilted her head. "That is why they invaded this place, built their monstrosities of stone and planted their flags atop our soil. Avarice is what divides people like Dresky from you, and it is why I have protected these wetlands for 600 years. "Might be," Argrave conceded with a nod. "I have some of that avarice you talk about, I'll give you that much, but not all men are the same. All this man wants is the prosperity of his religion." Argrave shook his head. "Orion wants his religion's propagation, the protection of its people. And right now, this plague stands as the biggest threat to that. He is ignorant about the plague jester. But I'm sure that you can convince him. He'll have no love for you, but he will trust you." Sylvic stepped forth, coming to stand before Argrave. Though not far enough to attack, he noted. She had two slots in her face where the liquid light in its body flowed especially thickly, and Argrave fixed his gaze on them like they were eyes. "Yet you are the aspect most concerning." Sylvic's head lowered, scanning him. "I sense the seed of something ancient within you, something far more powerful than everything in this meager corner of the world." "Do you do its bidding?" "I do my own bidding," Argrave protested at once. "The continent is falling apart. I have to patch it up to keep myself alive." "Well, myself and those I care about," he amended. "Things older than you or I stir. They corrupt the land, and they corrupt the people of the land. Something like this happening. It's not the natural order of things." Sylvic stepped away. "One who merely intends to stay alive would not know so much of these swamps." "My name? The Plague Jester." "You are foreign." Argrave reached into the mind bank, pulling free an old excuse. Erlebni knows. Though she possessed a wooden body, Argrave swore. Sylvic shuddered. "I see. Then your presence." "I am illuminated, yet more confused than ever before." Silence fell, and the sounds of the vast waterfalls at every edge were the only noise that persisted. This conversation had gone vastly different from how it was in Heroes of Berenda. The player was sent here to investigate the strange landscape, and it led them into the marred hallowed grounds. Once there, Dresky ordinarily died combating the player, and Sylvic ultimately revealed the source of the plague before helping the player. The differences didn't unease Argrave as much as they might have before. He was not the player. This was not Heroes of Berenda. and he was sure that things were going well. Very well. I shall assist you in enlisting this man blessed by the gods of the Serpent Kingdom. Sylvic turned back. My lady and light, I must counsel you. Dresky interrupted at once, kneeling before the old spirit of the swamps. Please, think of the lives lost here today, and make your decision once more. They were corpses walking, and more yet live, Sylvic refuted. My grief for those who have fallen is real, but I can set aside my enmity for the sake of this land. These wetlands are our home, and they are sullied by vengeance and its consequences. If I do not put a stop to that, I have failed as one of this land's guardians. If you step beyond your domain, my lady and light, you may die. Dresky continued to counsel, undeterred. I will die regardless, child. Sylvic stepped up to its guardian, holding out her arm afflicted with the waxpox. Look at my arm. Persisting as I do would be just that, persisting. Dresky looked off to the side, obviously not quite satisfied, but she did put her 2 sticks away. Sylvic looked over at Argrave once again. My answer remains the same. Argrave clapped his gloved hands together. Wonderful, he said with a smile. I am very glad that this ended amicably. As am I. Sylvic nodded. An awkward silence passed between the two of them. You may unready your attack, she pointed out. Argrave looked up to the sky, where hundreds of electric eels sparked. He felt their connection in his mind. He wanted to cry a little as he realized he'd probably need to dispose of them all. Briefly, his mind pondered ludicrous ways to put them back in the bottle, so to speak, but his mind produced nothing. So wasteful, he lamented. Mina stared at an extraordinarily tall man with wavy obsidian hair, kept somewhat long. It was not the black-haired man she thought she would set her eyes upon, but they did share the same father. Prince Induna Vasco sat at the foot of the grand banquet table, and opposite him was Mina's father, Count Elgar of Vedden. Like his daughter, he had golden hair and golden eyes, though that was their primary shared feature. He was a tall man, clearly a warrior. Mina shared most of her features with her mother, who sat just beside the Count. Mina's mother was the Count's second wife, taken not a week after his first had died. Her mother, Louise, was a commoner, the daughter of a merchant, and the marriage had been made to settle a grand debt. Her mother's low-born status coupled with a large number of other siblings from the first marriage made Mina's prominence in her house very low. Yet now, Mina, her father, her mother, and the prince sat at the table alone, none of her siblings present. Her father had come to trust her enough to have her present with a meeting with the prince. It was an honor, ostensibly, but Mina felt far from it. We're delighted to host the prince, Count Elgar said, voice somewhat higher-pitched in its flattery. Countess Louise murmured something of the same note. Are you? Indune mused, eating some of the food arrayed before him. Strange. I don't recall seeing any soldiers from Vedden joining my father's armies. Count Elgar shifted. Considering recent troubles, it is impractical. My entire land would fall victim to plague, and our food stores for the winter would be rendered useless. Plus, the winter makes things. Count Elgar rambled on and on, excuses coming from his lips so quickly that they must have been prepared in advance. Indune inquired, staring at her father. Mina was greatly unsettled. You may relax, Indune eventually interrupted, holding one palm out with a fork between his fingers. I am not here for any stern rebukes. No, my purpose is much different. Mina tensed further upon hearing he had a different purpose. After reports from other knights, she knew Argrave had passed through here. Despite the strange report of his eyes, the rest of his party matched with what she had last seen of him, barring an additional party member. He had headed into the northwest. Indune appearing might have something to do with him. And what might be your purpose here, Prince Indune, if you do not mind my inquiry? Count Elgar continued. You've called my daughter here. Even hearing that, her gaze briefly jumped to her father, but she was a good enough actor to betray nothing more than that. Inwardly, she felt an urge to run. Prince Indune was a horrible man, she knew. Yes, I did, Indune nodded, placing his fork down. I heard that Mina was the one that devised the idea for those camps outside the walls. As such, I wish to speak with her. And with you, her father, who put the plans into action. You see, Indune continued, placing his hands before him. I plan on making this place my base for a while. Vedden stands as one center between the north and the south, where many rivers converge. A veritable hub of activity. I intend on making it a bulwark against the plague, to stop it from spreading into the north as it has the south. Indune smiled. I hope you two might be of assistance in this matter. Mina didn't believe those words for a second. Indune's blue-eyed gaze fell upon her, and she felt the need to squirm. For now, let us enjoy this dinner, Indune said, picking his fork back up. Afterwards, I hope the Count and his daughter will indulge this plan of mine. Of course, Count Elgar agreed immediately. Speaking for his daughter, Mina kept her mouth shut. It was a learned skill. We will aid in whatever way we can. I won't threaten your neutrality, fret not, Indune assured. Her father did not reply to that, but he did look relieved. Other thoughts were running through Mina's head. Chasing after Argrave. It was just a whim, before. But now it seems like a necessity. He'll have some inkling of what's going on here. He always knew what was happening. He knew everyone's secrets. Another thought persisted in the back of her head, a more personal matter. It had stung at her every day for months. She was greatly afraid. But she had to know. Chapter 183, Coward's Choice. Argrave and Annalise sat in their tent, which had been pitched in a relatively dry spot of the wetlands. Argrave leaned up against Annalise as she read, feeling a little exhausted. Glimmen sat atop one of the crooks of the tallest trees, keeping watch vigilantly, while Dran read a book just beneath him. The two of them had separate tents just by each other. There were two other guests, one anticipated, and the other wholly not so. Sylvik laid down on the ground, doing nothing but merely existing. And Dresky the coward. Argrave scanned their camp, looking for the woman. What will happen to my lady and light? Dresky questioned, somewhat surprising Argrave. She stood just off to the side of the entrance to their tent, holding her sticks in hand. Up so close, Argrave could see the sticks she bore. Their core had been hollowed out and filled with the same glowing liquid light that resided within Sylvik. To be struck with them was to be struck by an aspect of an elder spirit of the wetlands, that is to say it would hurt very badly. Argrave gazed at Dresky, then cast a glance at Sylvik. I suspect Orion will bring both of you along to aid in the expedition through the wetlands, and the fight against the plague jester. He may be zealous, but he isn't stupid. He'll know your help is important in traversing the wetlands, dealing with whatever enemies might abound, and after. Dresky insisted. Argrave said nothing, searching for the right words. I will be killed, Sylvik answered before Argrave could say anything. Outside of the mud-hallowed grounds, her voice did not have the all-encompassing power it once did, but it was still bizarre. Dresky whipped her head back. What? Dresky, sweet child. If you had the opportunity to kill any of the gods of Vaska, would you take it? Sylvik questioned, unmoving. The woman stepped slowly to Sylvik, wooden armor clanking. She knelt down, then collapsed to her knees ungracefully before Sylvik. Though the wetland spirit did not move, the roots themselves curled out of the ground, bunching around Dresky's legs as if in comfort. Sylvik. Dresky muttered, not quite crying but verging on that point. Would you rather I succumb to this disease of the plague jester, what the human calls the waxpox? Sylvik questioned, voice almost amused. Let me die in service of the wetlands. This disease ruins all. That it came from this glorious land is tragedy enough. I must do what I can to right this wrong. It is not the natural order of things. Argrave was glad to be spared answering that question. Dresky grieved silently for a time, then went to sit elsewhere not far from Argrave's tent. He felt sympathy for the woman of the swamps, yet he could not deny being mildly annoyed that he was denied privacy with Annalise. I apologize for earlier rudeness, Dresky finally said. Argrave shook his head at once. Rudeness doesn't bother me, and we had not met under the best of terms. Were it something avoidable, I would not have slain those I did. The words came easy because they were the truth. It wasn't as though he had compromised his morals in killing Sylvik's guardians, but he generally did not like fighting. It was risky, and it hurt. Why do they call you the coward? Annalise questioned Dresky after a long amount of time had passed. Dresky wiped something away from her yellowish eyes, then turned to Annalise. They? She repeated. I call myself that. How do you know of it? I never mentioned it. I told her. Argrave closed his eyes. He had neglected to inform Annalise of the background for the nickname, largely because it wasn't important. It seems her curiosity spurred her to learn. Anyway, he heard Dresky shift, then answer, it's to remind me of what I am. Usually nicknames are for other people, not yourself, Argrave pointed out tiredly, and Annalise nudged him with her shoulder in slight reprimand. Remind you of what? Annalise continued, trying to suppress Argrave's comment. When the men beyond the swamp invaded, with gleaming metal armor and spells that tore apart the very land. I did not fight in defense of my land. I ran, as a coward. I let my family die alone. Dresky said. The words had weight, but she had moved past her grief enough to say them without shaking. My lady and light welcomed me into her hallowed land. She protected me, sheltered me. She taught me. When the waxpox came and ate away my flesh, she imbued her own body into me to prevent my death, she noted, pointing to patches of her body that had been replaced with wood. I vowed not to make the same mistake with my lady and light. I vowed to defend her to my last breath. And so, I call myself coward, because it is what I hope to prove I am not. Argrave opened his eyes again, looking at Dresky as he leaned against Annalise's shoulder. Willingness to die for something. On his first day here, that sentiment might have been foreign to him. He was beginning to understand it, though. Maybe it was because he was around people who would die for a cause, people like Titus, Orion, or the Southron elves. Or maybe it was because he had something to value in this life beyond himself. Now, just as the somber tones were beginning to set in his head, Annalise tilted her head and rested it against his. It was a simple act, but it made him feel warm. If the waxpox is cured, you don't need to die, Argrave said slowly. You can still escape, Sylvik. Dresky looked towards the wetland spirit with hope, but Sylvik said at once, you make it sound like escaping this man you call Orion's grasp will be something easy. It pointed out. The wetlands themselves balk in fear of him. I fear I am powerless before him, even were my power not waned by this rotting disease. Dresky looked greatly dispirited. What is your purpose? Annalise inquired of Sylvic. Why do people worship you? I am simply the Wetlands. I'm the advocate of the water beneath us, the trees around us, the beauty and ugliness all. I simply wish to see it prosper, as it always has. I am but a manifestation of the desires of the folk who once lived in this swamp. I am the spirit of the Wetlands. With the emphasis on the word spirit, Annalise nodded as things fell in place. That is another reason I am not afraid to die, Sylvic added. In time. Centuries, perhaps. So long as this land persists, another of my kind will be born. Perhaps it will be different from me. Perhaps it will not be called Wetlands any longer. There is something special to this land, you know. Maybe the Wetlands will progress into coal forests, Argrave mused, recalling useless geographical knowledge. And this plague uses what is special of this land to sow discord, Sylvic said. That is why it must be stopped. Mina of Veden entered deep into the Wetlands, riding alone. She wore nothing to identify herself as the daughter of Count Elgar. It was a double-edged sword, she supposed, but she did not wish to announce her presence to any and all who looked. But just because she rode alone did not mean she was alone. Golden-armored knights escorted her. Mina watched them ever warily. She could see that their flesh had been afflicted with the waxpox, and though it was covered by bandages, she had no strong desire to contract this disease. Despite their affliction, these knights seemed as capable as any of the royal knights she had seen before. As they neared a fortress, the royal knights stopped. This is as far as we will take you, lady. This is the camp of our holiness. Mina stirred, holding her horse steady. Though she had come here searching for Argrave, having heard from her father's knights that he'd gone this way, the only reason she risked coming here was because Orion was not near as dangerous as the other princes. Yet seeing his knights and hearing their address, she wondered every second if this was a mistake. May I meet Prince Ryan? Mina nonetheless asked. Any and all may meet the prince, so long as they are willing to wait for him, the knight said plainly. He resides within his keep. Without another word, the knights parted, and Mina looked towards the keep that they had pointed out. She drove her horse a bit closer, mindful of the great bulk of people wandering. Though she had thought Veden was bad enough, seeing this place now gave her chills. This disease was brutal beyond compare. In the ruined keep, a great horde of people gathered. Between their zealous cheers and their praises, they seemed more a religious congregation than a camp of refugees. In the back, towering over all of them, was Orion of Vaska. He was free of the disease, and yet he mingled without fear. The people reached for him like he was the most precious gemstones, clutching at his armor. He embraced all of them, speaking and touching and tending to them. Mina struggled to keep her horse in line as she pondered this scene. She looked up towards the sky. Night was only just beginning. She looked at the vast crowd, biting her lip and debating herself fiercely. Something drew her eye, more golden-armored royal knights, and she spurred her horse towards them. Excuse me, she greeted them. They had seemed normal enough, but once they turned their head, Mina saw they were as disease-ridden as those she had seen before. She tried not to display her disgust outwardly. I'm looking for someone. Can I ask some questions? Please, my lady. The gods demand we be open and honest, the knight said, voice a low rasp. Mina clenched her reins tighter, uneased. Has a tall man with black and gold eyes come through here? Argrave, he goes by. The two knights exchanged a glance. Why do you seek him? I'm a friend of his. I need to talk to him, she said, trying to put urgency in her tone to coax information. You must consult Orion. One of the knights held his palm out. We dare not betray our holiness brother by giving away information laxly. Mina nodded, then looked about the camp. She turned her head back to the road, then back to the large congregation. You're looking for my brother, another voice cut in, even and dead. Mina pulled her horse's reins and it stepped backwards. Once Mina identified who the voice belonged to, she kept leading her horse away. It was only once Magnus stopped a fair distance away did she allow herself to relax somewhat. She didn't know much about Magnus, but she had not heard good things about him. He was the true shame of Vaska, wandering the continent and engaging in the most base pleasures. I want to talk to him, Mina repeated. Magnus put one hand to his clean-shaven chin. He was here. He'll return, too, given he left his horses here. Orion has it guarded, but he was sharing a room with his fiancée. Mina blinked quickly, trying to hide her surprise. His fiancée? She questioned, keeping her tone neutral. You say you're his friend, yet you don't know this much? Magnus took his hand off his chin. Curious. She felt a complex array of emotions at that moment. The matter of Nicoletta resurfaced again, even though she'd been trying her best to avoid thinking about it. Who was it? She demanded, more harshly than she intended. Magnus raised a brow. Oh? Maybe my little brother is not so in love with that stupidly tall elf if a pretty girl comes seeking him. Growing angry at the mention of a fiancé, Mina glared down at Magnus before softening her features. It seemed she'd be staying after all. Chapter 184, Testimony of the Divine. Argrave stepped into Orion's camp in the ruined fortress, walking past the vast tents and buildings full of refugees. His stride was confident, but the mercenaries walking at his feet were somewhat frenzied, betraying his true nervousness. Everyone watched him walk, this time, not because of his imposing height, but because of the two following behind, Sylvic and Dresky. His entry into the camp was like a great triple that intensified rather than weakened. Though the sick could not be bothered to stir, those tending to them did, and soon enough, near half the camp was bustling with activity. Nothing would ever abate the nervousness of being the center of attention, Argrave thought. 2 golden armored knights rushed up before Argrave, drawing their glimmering swords from their scabbards. Argrave stepped out to meet them, holding his arms wide as he yelled, "You will stop." His authoritative words did slow them, but they kept proceeding, forcing Argrave to add, "I am Ryan's brother." With their holiness being invoked, the wax knights did indeed draw to a sliding stop not 2 feet away from Argrave. Already, mist from his brimstone danced in the air, ready to attack if anything threatened him. Orion sought proof, Argrave began, gaze alternating between the 2 wax knights. "I have brought it." The camp remained bustling in the time that passed since Argrave had brought Sylvic to Orion's camp. A retinue of 12 wax knights guarded them. Everyone able enough to walk in the refugee camp gawked at the humanoid wetland spirit. Sylvic remained largely silent and still, but the sight of her wooden body flowing with radiant liquid light was awe-inspiring even when she did nothing. Fewer stared at the short and squat swampland woman Dresky with her greenish skin and yellow eyes, but her presence only intensified the scrutiny placed upon them. Anneliese looked greatly discomforted by the attention. She had once confided to him large crowds were difficult for her, and so Argrave did his best to keep her at ease while they waited for Orion. Regarding his other 2 companions, Glimmer was ever unflappable. Wildren somewhat enjoyed the scrutiny of the crowd, all but striking a pose for those watching. It was easy to notice Prince Orion coming. He himself stood 1.5 feet above the taller people in the crowd, and the people parted for his coming like the Red Sea had for another prophet of myth. Argrave kept his gaze on him as he walked closer, Argrave's dark golden eyes meeting Orion's grey the whole way through. Eventually, Orion strode past the wax knights, ordering them to put their swords away with a simple gesture. They obeyed without question and kneeled before him. Prince Orion stood before Argrave. His eyes were markedly colder than their first meeting had been. Argrave was glad to be spared of a back-breaking embrace, but that was about the only good feeling swirling around in his chest at that moment. Orion stood above him, above even Gilliman, and seeing the anger writ in his face was like having the roaring jaw of a Kodiak bear near your throat. "What profane thing have you brought into this camp of followers of the faith, Argrave?" Orion questioned, his voice cold and unsympathetic. The affectionate calls of brother were gone. Argrave kept his composure despite his fear. He was growing quite adept at that. "You asked for proof, brother. I brought it before you." Orion looked past Argrave, staring at Sylvic. He stepped around him, looking down and locking gazes with Gilliman briefly. After, he took heavy steps that seemed to shake the earth. Dresky stood between Sylvic and Orion, posturing like a child trapped between 2 adults. She was only barely to Orion's stomach, but she stood strong nonetheless. "Rest assured," Argrave called out. "I would not have brought Sylvic here were she a danger to everyone." Orion turned his back to Sylvic, his white robe brushing against the muddy ground below as his gaze fixed upon Argrave. "What is it?" "I am Sylvic, one of many spirits of the wetlands, and a god to the swamp folk," Sylvic answered, her voice without an obvious source emanating from all directions causing a great stir in all of the people present. Orion turned his head back to the wetland spirit ever so slowly. His fists were clenched tightly enough to trigger the protective enchantments on his gauntlet, and they shone brightly, barely preventing the metal from folding in on itself. Argrave stepped forward. "She's here for the same reason you are, Orion. She wants to stop the plague. If you care about the followers of the faith, I hope you will hear her out. If you listen, you will learn," he implored Orion boldly. Orion's head remained fixed on Sylvic's form. Slowly, his gaze turned back to Argrave. The insane frigidity in his eyes had faded somewhat, making his expression seem less threatening. But Argrave still noted his fist was clenched tightly. Prince Orion gave the smallest of nods, and Argrave let out a sigh of relief just as slight. "Then, should we go discuss this?" Argrave gestured towards the keep where Orion had taken him. "Anneliese, and Magnus." Orion put one hand on his hip and shifted his feet, considering what Argrave said. "That which is to be shared, is it something that needs to be kept secret from the people?" Magnus chimed in, pushing his way past. The crowd did not part for him as it had Orion, evidently, and indeed, it seemed he had little goodwill among the people here. Even though Argrave thought it was a reasonable enough sentiment to garner support, few in the crowd expressed their backing for it. "That is true," Orion said, though, very obviously swayed. Anneliese put her hand on Argrave's shoulder, drawing his attention. This was another signal they devised in private, much the same way she would tap his foot if someone lied. If she had something to note about the emotions of those present, she would grab his shoulder. She did not have time to say what she needed to say, though. Orion spoke again, asking, "Then tell me, brother, why do you consort with such profane things, such heretics? What can it convey, that should spare it from righteous judgment by the gods?" Argrave swallowed, trying to discern how best to maintain control of the conversation. With a crowd of zealous followers around and Magnus whispering in Orion's ear, the odds felt stacked against him. But the fight yesterday had been at a disadvantage before Argrave turned it around. At least, That was what he clung onto to bolster his confidence. "You're right," Argrave agreed with Magnus, seeking to mitigate his influence. "The people have every right to know why they are wrought with this disease. They should understand what Orion and I will fight against," he said boldly. His words drew in support from the crowd. As the crowd murmured and cheered, Annalise whispered in Argrave's ear, "Magnus is desperately terrified." "Of what?" "I cannot say." The words were somewhat difficult for Argrave to process fully. Too many possibilities abounded in his head, and so he chose to shelve them away and focus on Orion. "Sylvic has come here to seek Orion's aid in fighting against a great evil that has taken root in the wetlands," Argrave preached. "This evil was born of evil. It was born of the extermination of the people of these swamps, when Vaska conquered this place decades ago." Argrave turned on his heel. "Sylvic, please, tell all of how this plague came to be." Magnus stared down Argrave like he was a fool, while Sylvic placed her wooden, rooted hand behind her back in an almost polite, human fashion. "Some years ago, the many spirits of the wetland took in those people of the swamp that survived the invasion by Vaska," Sylvic explained. "Many of the spirits had died in the invasion. And of those that persisted, one sought revenge against Vaska for the deaths of many. Rastsintin, the strongest of us wetland spirits. He collaborated with one of the last great shamans of the swamp folk. She had been taken in as an amusement by humans, a jester, they are called. At first, they struck at the stone fortresses the men of Vaska constructed," Sylvic continued, none daring to interrupt. "One after another they fell, each house established succumbing in a multitude of ways. If you seek proof of the truth of my tales, I will show you the magic they weaved to turn this fortress we stand upon to ruins," Sylvic declared. Argrave listened patiently, watching the crowd. They were growing a bit incensed, he noted, but they did not seem at risk of exploding anytime soon. Magnus twitched and rubbed his hands together as Sylvic spoke, glancing about paranoidly. His distress perplexed Argrave. Yet once all of the fortresses collapsed, Rastsintin was content. The jester did not agree with this sentiment. "She betrayed him and used his power to conjure this plague. I, and many other spirits of the wetlands, attempted to stop this folly. Yet Rastsintin was always the strongest of us all, and in my endeavors, the plague jester struck me and others with her fell disease, leaving me as I am now," she noted, routed finger tracing the waxpox marring her body. The crowd took in her words well. There was an element of sympathy to things, seeing even a so-called god marred as they were by the waxpox surely stirred some emotion in them. Orion stalked after her, arms crossed. "You can prove this fortress fell to this Rastsintin's magic?" "I can," Sylvic confirmed. "And you swear before all you hold dear that you speak only truth?" "I swear before the wetlands themselves I speak the truth. If I do not, may the world itself burn me and all I hold dear," Sylvic vowed. Orion looked back to Argrave. His gaze was complicated. Magnus strode up beside Orion. Argrave watched him carefully, ready to interject at anything the prince might try. "It seems there is no room for argument," Magnus conceded, spreading his arms out. Argrave furrowed his brows, taken aback by the support. Magnus leaned in and whispered something to Orion's ears, and Argrave shifted uneasily. "Argrave," Orion said, lifting his head from Magnus' whispers. "What has Sylvic informed you of regarding this heretical god, Rastsintin, and the jester?" Argrave stepped a little closer. "Much and more. I can tell you everything you need to know, brother," he said confidently. "Then that settles things." He turned his head to Sylvic and Dresky. "Will the two of you accept the gods of Vaska as your own?" Dresky shook her head fervently. "No, I am of the wetlands," Sylvic responded. Orion turned the rest of his body and lunged out at Sylvic within human speed. Dresky, ever alert, moved to guard her lady and light, drawing the twin sticks at her side. She swung them at the approaching Orion. He raised his forearm to block. When they cracked against the metal, blisteringly blinding light and force enough to conjure wind split across the air. When things had settled, Argrave ran forward without hesitation, adrenaline already pumping. Orion seemed undamaged. He flicked his arm out and Dresky staggered away. He lunged forth again. Dresky his target this time. He grabbed her face, obscuring it completely, and slammed her into the ground. The earth split, and her body left a crater her shape in the muddy earth. N0vlusp.c0m. After he squeezed. Her head seemed to offer as little resistance as a ball of hollow paper. The prince lifted his hand slowly. Blood that glowed gold dripped from his forearm, not from Dresky, but from the wound she'd caused with her weapons. As Sylvic stepped back apprehensively, Argrave finally managed to place himself between Orion and the wetland spirit. "What are you doing?" Argrave shouted. "Doing as the gods demand, ending the heretics that refuse to accept Vaska," he said calmly. Blood dripped from the spot where Dresky had attacked him. His blood suspended midair, and then retracted back within his body. Almost as though shutting the door behind it, the wound closed just after the last bit of blood retracted back within. The enchanted gauntlets he wore had been completely blasted apart by Dresky's fierce attack, but already the wound disappeared. "Were you not listening? She has much to offer to help." "Knowledge you claim you have." Orion tilted his head, confused. "Sylvic has yet to prove the magic Rastsintin cast," Argrave shouted. "And she can help us through the wetlands with her power," that we might strike at the plague jester all the easier, without a great loss of life. Orion's face brightened. That is a fair point, brother, he conceded at once. He lifted up his hand, covered in blood and gore. The redness bubbled and steamed as though boiling. I was overeager, it seems. He moved his hand forward, resting it against Argrave's cheek. Fortunately, you reminded me before something important could be lost. I am glad of it. The holy fool stepped away from the scene of carnage casually, shaking his hand free of the viscera. I am glad you brought this to me. To wallow in ignorance as I have, for so long. He sighed and shook his head. Such a tragedy. Argrave. He called out, stopping. Argrave faced him tensed, saying nothing. Have a rest. You seem to have endured much to bring this to me, he said, genuinely compassionately. Though, ensure the heretical thing causes no trouble. As Orion walked away, Argrave felt like he was going to collapse to the ground. He kept his legs firm, thankfully enough. Eventually, his gaze locked on someone skulking away from the still staring crowd, Prince Magnus. That man had been the cause of all of this. Whatever he'd whispered to Orion had set him off like that. He looked at Annalise. Let's go back. But it seems we can't rest. They started to walk away. Argrave turned his head back to where Dresky lay dead. As he stared at the corpse, something unpleasant welled up within him. He quickly turned away, blinking rapidly. Darren put a hand on his shoulder, staring at the corpse alongside him. With silent grief for their brief companion, Argrave's companions and Sylvik headed for the keep. Chapter 185, Left Behind, but Catching Up. Argrave told Gilliman, Darren, and the very out-of-place Sylvik that he and Annalise intended to check up on their books before rejoining the party to discuss what needed to be done. Sylvik asked to bury Dresky, and his companions saw to that task alongside her so that no issues would arise with the Wax Knights or other residents. Was almost like things correcting themselves, Argrave mused as he pushed open the door, stepping inside. Dresky. God damn it. Why did it have to end like that? I should have what? Annalise pressed. Argrave stopped beside the half-open door. I don't know. Should have known better. Should have taken measures. People tell you time and time again that way of thinking leads nowhere. When will you heed that lesson? She questioned. Lot easier to say that than to do it. Don't deny you ask the same thing, Argrave refuted. Annalise just grabbed his wrist, giving it a solemn squeeze. It reminded him he wasn't the only one affected by the things that happened around him. He flashed a bitter smile, then said, hopefully that little display helps keep Darren cautious. Darren is different than he was before, Annalise said. I don't think he will cause trouble as he did in the Lionsome Castle. I definitely hope not. Argrave shook his head, stepping within the room and glancing about. He took a mental inventory of all within. Everything was as neat and orderly as it had been left. Then, his eyes fell upon something he had not been expecting to see, a human figure, greatly distorted by illusion magic. At once, Argrave raised his hand up and formed the matrix for a fast-acting lightning spell, the C rank, Sky Sunder. With a yelp, the person threw themselves behind Argrave's bed, shouting, wait. Argrave kept his hand raised, but said tentatively, Mina? Annalise stepped within the room cautiously, coming to stand shoulder to shoulder with Argrave. Mina gingerly raised her head above the bed, and Argrave lowered his hand with mouth agape. What in the hell are you doing here? He demanded. Last time it was a book, now you nearly throw a spell at me? Mina said incredulously, rising up a little further. Mina of Veden had changed a great deal from when Argrave had last seen her. As ever, she looked like a cat, but some maturity shone through on her face. Her once shoulder-length yellow hair had grown much longer than that, and her yellow eyes seemed tired. I never expected to deal with this situation a second time. He shook his head. I'll ask again. What the hell, Mina? I'm sorry, I am. It's different this time. I was expecting you to come back, wanted to talk to you. Mina said urgently. Argrave scratched his cheek. Yet you still use an illusion spell, just the same as ever. Because I thought I'd win. This time, she shook her head. Gods be damned. He briefly recalled their little game of whether or not she would surprise him and snorted. Argrave stepped away and looked around, and seeing no one was present, shut the door. Why aren't you at Mateth? He began, stepping back into the room. Why are you here? Looking to follow the current trend, catch a life-threatening disease? Mina's yellow eyes gazed up at him. You don't know, do you? She questioned, then shook her head. I guess it's my world, but really, no one knows besides me. She shook her head, then looked up at Argrave. I thought I changed a lot, but you changed a lot, she noted, sizing him up. You look healthier, scarier, she admitted. Argrave waited patiently. He could tell she was dodging the question because she found it painful to answer. That alone was answer enough, he supposed. She stepped around and sat on Argrave's bed, arms crossed. Why do people say you call her your fiancé? She gestured with her chin towards Annalise. Why are your eyes all wrong? Argrave sighed, and Annalise conjured a word that the three of them might speak privately. Mina watched her warily. I remember her, she pointed. She's the elven woman you brought from the land of the snow elves. Brought is a poor choice of words, Argrave said as he nodded. Her name is Annalise, in case you forgot. And yes, For all intents and purposes, we are engaged. I've answered one of yours, now time for mine. Why aren't you at Mateth? He came to stand over her. You said you were never wrong about these things, she said bitterly, her throat seized up. Nikki sent me away. She said that it wasn't right, and that she was sorry. Though Argrave wasn't exactly blindsided by her answer, it did make him feel much worse than he expected. The fact that Mina was desperately trying to stop herself from being emotional about it made it strike all the deeper, he found. And here you are, she continued, sniffling once, with a fiancé, whom you spend the whole night with, keeping the whole keep up with. Moans, and, hey, whoa. Argrave held his finger out. I don't know what kind of twisted fantasies are brewing in that head of yours, but put them out of your mind. If there's anything heated going on in this room at night, it's heated talks about magic and history. He pointed to the books around the room. Annalise hid her face with one hand despite the fact that it was covered by a mask and shook her head. Argrave was still sure he saw a faint smile of amusement, though. Please. Magnus seemed to have mistaken me for your spurned lover, and so he divulged everything about you too. She shook her head. He was trying to turn me against you. I know. He's a rude bastard. Magnus. Argrave lifted his head up and nodded, face blanking as his half-brother's name came out once more. Argrave spared a glance at Annalise, and she nodded as though she knew what he was thinking. It was very obvious that Magnus was trying to impede Argrave at every turn. It went against what he knew of Magnus. As far as he knew, he and Argrave had no animosity between the two of them. It was clear to him that something needed to be done about this. He just wasn't certain what, yet. Argrave turned his head back to Mina. You know, Annalise and I spent one night in this keep, and... well, whatever, he finally surrendered. Think what you want, I can't stop you. But why did you come here, of all places? You don't appear ill. Not yet, at least. He glanced around the room. You ought to wear one of these masks. Keep your health up. He stepped around, searching for the solemn white humorless masks. Indune came to Vedden, Mina disclosed, looking at Argrave. I figured you might have some answers about that whole situation. Argrave turned back to Mina slowly, face taut. I think we ought to spend some time catching up, then. It seems there's a lot to talk about. Argrave and Annalise had a long conversation with Mina of Vedden. As things proceeded, all of them loosened up a great deal, misunderstandings were resolved, animosity was put to bed, and mutual understanding was established. Despite everything, Mina knew that Argrave alone could not be held responsible for Nicoletta's choice. She appeared to be placing her position as the heir to the Duke before her own desire for happiness. Knowing it was Nicoletta's choice didn't make Argrave feel less guilty. Of course, he felt like he'd ruined something. He didn't tell Mina, but he resolved to repair what had been broken. Their conversation lasted the entire night. At first, they spoke of Mina's situation. Apparently, the time she'd spent with Nicoletta and Duke Enrico in a city devoted to trade and administration had enlightened her about the importance of proper management, and she used the lessons about order and efficiency learned to solve the refugee crisis at Vedden. But inevitably, Argrave had to explain how he'd changed, and what he'd done to do so. That took up the bulk of the conversation, and though Argrave felt it was a somewhat disdainful waste of time to recount something that had no bearing on what they were to be doing, he did so. Not without complaint, though. That topic led them to why Argrave was here, something he disclosed readily. Apparently, Nicoletta had long ago informed Mina of his fight against Gerektik Kiet. He resented that Nicoletta could not keep a secret, but Mina told no others, and it was not genuinely harmful if rumor of it did spread. It was, ultimately, one of his long-term goals to propagate information about the coming calamity. Eventually, Argrave arranged a place to stay for Mina alongside Dran, Gilliman, and the wetland spirit Sylvic. He gave her a spare humorless mask of Annalise's. They agreed to discuss things tomorrow, when both were better rested. Once things had settled, he was finally alone with Annalise, a fact he was glad of. You say Magnus was scared, terrified earlier? He asked her, sitting on his bedside. Desperately so, Annalise confirmed. Argrave lowered his head, thinking in silence for a long while. As his brain spun for explanations, he half hoped Annalise would interject. She always had bright ideas, things that he'd missed, perspective he lacked. But she stayed silent, offering no further insight. Considering the possibilities, Argrave began, leading the conversation. Ilnor's an option, a likely option, too. She has the resources to make Magnus move. Plenty of money, plenty of non-monetary assets. Yet, Argrave shook his head. I don't know if she could terrify him as you mention. Magnus is fearless, despite everything. And Dune, then? Or the other brother you mentioned, Levin? Even Felipe? Annalise continued his train of thought. In Dune. Well, he is nearby, Argrave conceded. Levin is pretty ruthless, with a certain low cunning to him. Felipe is probably too busy rallying the North and keeping his court in line, but maybe he could. Even still, once again, could they terrify Magnus? And what would be their motive to have him impede me? Specifically, on top of all of that, I can't picture how they would know I'm here. No, Magnus was doing something here before I arrived and wants to stop because I'm interfering. I suppose that is all that fits. Annalise nodded. Yet what would be his motive to continue the plague? I don't know. He could just be worthless trash, human scum, that kind of thing. Argrave rubbed his mouth with his hand, losing himself in thought. As a stray thought came to him, he laughed. What? Annalise looked at him expectantly. Maybe it was Jerry, Argrave posited in jest. Annalise looked at him blankly, so he clarified. Gerektikiet. Annalise did not join him in laughter, but rather genuinely considered it, tilting her head. Come on, Argrave said at once. Just a joke. You must admit it does fit, Annalise said in quiet ponderance. Yeah, that's why it's funny, Argrave nodded. Seeing she was still on this point, Argrave gave an exhausted sigh and rose to his feet, walking around. I don't know. Gerektikiet doesn't really work with collaborators. He just destroys and ruins things at the right time so everything falls apart. He demolishes the most essential pillar in a building, and the rest crumbles naturally. In your experience, Annalise pointed out. Why else would Magnus be so diametrically opposed to everything you do? Why else would he be terrified? You claim the man is a psychopath. He does not feel much of anything, searches out for anything that spurs emotion at all. What else could terrify that grey slate? He is more than a godlike entity. She spoke quickly as though a theory formed in her head. That's verging on paranoia. Argrave shook his head a little and then pointed at Annalise, walking close to her and kneeling right before her face where she sat. If we take it there, let's take it further back. Titus. Too much of course happened in the burnt desert for that to be some ripple effect from the little beating of my butterfly's wings. Annalise furrowed her white brows. Is that even possible? She questioned. Can the Calamity place such a heavy hand in this world before his advent? I don't know, Argrave admitted. I don't know the extent of his influence. I don't know what he can and can't have a hand in. That was never clearly defined, and all his schemes in Heroes of Berenda began before the game started. That's part of the reason I never considered it. Jerry was never reactive. I'm not even sure if this is possible. All of it might just be a red herring, useless paranoia. Annalise nodded, processing his words. Then, what has he done? What do you know? All I know about his influence on people, specifically, is that he's responsible for a lot of the craziness in the royal family. The first queen dying in childbirth, that was him. The second queen's insanity. All of this was specifically tailored to ruin Felipe's mental state, cause Vasca's decline, he explained. You might argue he affected people's minds, but why would he go after Magnus instead of me? Why wouldn't the big G use 5G to fry my brain, personally? What are you saying? Annalise said, losing the thread of the conversation. I've got no idea. Argrave stood up and paced around. All right. Ultimately, we're just fumbling around in the dark. Come here. Annalise tapped the side of the bed, and Argrave obediently walked over and sat beside her. Argrave took some time to relax. It felt like a grey curtain had washed over him, mounting stress that had reached its breaking point. I'm at a loss, Annalise. She wrapped one arm around his shoulders. All we have presently are suspicions, she said slowly. That's right, he nodded, listening intently. Yet we have a method to confirm those suspicions, she continued. Magnus is still here, within the camp, and given his dogged interference, it would be prudent to deal with him before we set out on this expedition. He is but a man. Even still, we need not look for the backer when the agent is in arm's reach. Argrave's bleak outlook grew a little brighter with Annalise's counsel. Eventually, he nodded. Yeah, even if it is urgent to deal with this plague as quickly as possible, it's also best to do it right. I'm sure it'll take some time for the expedition to get ready. And even if not, I can get Orion to delay. I have to make sure we do it perfectly. This isn't something we can afford to muck up. If the plague doesn't end, we can say goodbye to any chances of an easy victory. And while we're dealing with Magnus, we can identify other factors that might impede the whole thing. Precisely, she nodded. Argrave looked up towards the ceiling. Gerektikiet. I wonder if he's listening. Argrave cracked his knuckles. That'd be an interesting turn of events. He gets to listen as I shoot his damn plans into the dust. Chapter 186. Taming of the Prince. I can handle it, Durrant suggested, raising one hand up. What? Argrave asked. The four members of Argrave's party sat in one of their rooms, two of them with humorless masks donned. A few empty bottles lay around, though it did look suspiciously like alcohol. They were the potions Argrave had demanded Gilliman brew to give his party more disease resistance. Mina had yet to wake up, but Argrave intended to speak with her about something, too. You want your big brother Magnus to croak some info about the big bad evil. It so happens this is an interest of mine. If he really does have a god whispering in his ear, I'm sure I can figure it out, he suggested, entwining his grey wyvern scale gauntleted hands. And how exactly are you going to do that? Argrave frowned, tilting his head in disbelief. Hey, if you don't want me to, say no. I'll get in line. I don't want to be stepping on any toes with that damned maniac wandering about. You see the way he crushed that poor girl's head? Argrave nodded and looked to the ground. At least Dresky died the way she wanted, Gilliman said. His arms crossed. Argrave looked to him, frowning. No one can call her a coward, fighting against that man as boldly as she did, he concluded further, closing his eyes. Argrave nodded in agreement, but he found himself thinking of the scene once again and shook his head. He focused back on the matter at hand, Durin's suggestion. He mulled over the matter, biting at his lip as he thought, then continued, "You have to keep in mind this is just a suspicion of mine, not a confirmed fact." Argrave held his hand out and pointed at Durin. "Which is why you're asking me to confirm it." Durin nodded, looking at Argrave like he was slow. "That's kind of how confirming works. You realize when you're uncertain, you don't get all cute about it." Argrave held out his hands to stifle Durin, which made the Golden Tattooed tribal laugh. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Durin shrugged as he shook his head. "Very encouraging." Argrave furrowed his brows. "I'm resourceful." Durin held both of his hands out. "Look, if you don't think I can, just say no, and this matter's closed." "Argrave, you don't need to collapse any more towering pieces of architecture to keep me in line." Argrave lowered his head, rubbing his chin as he thought about the matter. Certainly, Durin was a main character in Heroes of Berenda. The player always did all kinds of ridiculously obscure investigation quests without much issue, which said something about all of the characters and their resourcefulness. Even excluding Heroes of Berenda, Durin had proven himself. Despite Argrave's compunctions about the matter with the Margrave's wyvern, the fact remained it worked out well. Argrave lifted his head and said decisively, "I'll allow it. But first, you'll have to hear everything I know about Magnus so that you can act easier, make no mistakes, that sort of thing." Durin lounged back. "I'm sure you just want an excuse to talk more. But fine." Argrave shook his head but smiled. "All right. Once that's done, we'll check on Sylvik, make sure she's settled in without issue, and then I'll have a conversation with Mina." His smile grew bitter. "Have to make sure nothing else goes wrong, Hash. How can you be so fine?" "The suns are barely above the trees, and I'm still half asleep," Mina complained, rubbing at her eyes as she sat across from Argrave and Annalise. They sat at a dining table in an abandoned part of the keep, largely alone. Annalise's star sparrow ate magic seeds off the table before them, and the elven woman played with the creature idly. Argrave's Brummersinners still slept, nestled in his grey duster. All of them sat within a ward of Annalise's making, ensuring no sound would leak. Glimmin stood nearby, remaining standing. Durin was off doing his thing. Argrave couldn't deny that he was worried. It might be Durin decides that Magnus would be better off unlive. The part that disquieted Argrave was that the idea didn't seem such a poor one, provided it never linked back to any of them. He was changing, it seemed. "I can be so fine because I've been doing this for months now," Argrave explained. "Waking up when I don't want to, doing things I don't want to do, and then going to bed far later than I would like. I'm well accustomed to early mornings." "You could call me a spoiled brat in fewer words." She finished rubbing her eyes. Argrave smiled and laughed lightly. "By the way, try not to rub your eyes and keep that mask on tight. They weren't cheap, and they're very effective at preventing the waxpox, or any disease, I suppose." Mina froze like she'd been caught doing something bad, and then said, "I just washed my hands." Argrave simply smiled, saying nothing. As if cowed, Mina quickly put the humorless mask back over her face. "Well, whatever." She quickly shook her head, voice now distorted from behind the white solemn mask. "Why don't you wear one? You got so sick so easily last time at Mateth." Argrave placed his hands on the table. "We talked about this. I'm black-blooded now, like dragons." Mina tilted her head suspiciously. Argrave sighed and took off his glove, then took a small splinter off the table to draw some blood. Mina cocked her head back, a little shocked. Blood started to drip out. It was very dark in color. "Argrave," Annalise said exasperatedly, then healed his finger in an almost casual fashion. Argrave held his finger out. "If you drank this, some of your magic would replenish, you know." "Normal people don't do something like that to prove a point," Mina said cautiously. Argrave turned and very nearly offered his finger to Gilliman as a jest, before he realized present company might take that poorly. Ultimately, he wiped the blood away and said, "Normal people don't have magic in their bloodstream. I was more talking about the fact people find it difficult to hurt themselves." Mina shook her head. Argrave smiled at that. "It's been a long journey," he said simply. He saw Gilliman nod in agreement in his peripheries. Mina stared at him for a time with complex emotions shining through even despite the mask, then shook her head to dismiss errant thoughts. "Well, enough. We can finally talk about why I came here." "And Dune, why in the world is he bursting into my father's keep, wanting to speak to me, of all people?" Argrave blinked slowly, a little taken aback. After sparing a glance at Annalise as she put her hair back into a half-crown braid, he turned his gaze back to Mina and rested his elbows on the table. "You see, that's a funny question. It sort of tailors into what I wanted to talk to you about, you see." Mina's eyes widened in anticipation. "So you know why he's there?" "I knew talking to you would be the right idea." Argrave scratched his cheek, feeling the conversation had become all the more difficult. "Well, to put it in simple terms, no," he said plainly. Mina's face darkened. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh," Argrave repeated. "You've got no idea?" Mina placed her hands on the table, leaning in. Argrave straightened his back. "What did he say?" "Complete nonsense. He said he came here to stop the plague, She spread her arms out in a disbelieving shrug. Argrave furrowed his brows. Come to think of it, you said that you were the one behind that change in Vedden, he noted. Mina nodded. Nikki's smart. The more I stayed by her side, the more I learned. She conscripted me for some things, you see. She'll be the greatest head of House Montesi there ever has been, Mina said proudly. She had to deal with refugees from the Vadaman invasion. I just applied some of those lessons on a lesser scale. Argrave noted. She cast a glance at Annalise as she spoke of the Vadaman invasion. He shelved that observation and focused on the important matter. Indune. You ever think Indune might be? Argrave began, biting his lip. I don't know, honestly. Perhaps he was being honest, Annalise suggested as she finished her half-crown braid. Mina scoffed, then spoke to Annalise, saying, you might not know much about Indune being from that frozen land, but he's a real monster. A butcher with a princely mantle, nothing more. Argrave held his finger out to stop her. But he's not stupid. Things have gotten bad in the south. I can attest to that as much as you can, probably. Between the warmer climate and King Felipe ostensibly hastening the disease, it's tearing the south apart. You think the king? Mina began, then took a deep breath as epiphany dawned on her. It makes sense. Argrave nodded bitterly. If Indune had seen how bad the south is, he might take it upon himself to keep it away from the north, as Annalise suggests. Mina didn't look quite satisfied with that answer, but she said nothing. That brings me to a favor I had to ask, Argrave began gingerly. Mina looked at him. I was hoping that you would be willing to make sure Indune doesn't come here. Mina's face shifted from behind the mask. I can't believe this, she said in disbelief while shaking her head. Argrave proceeded quickly, sensing her disapproval. Indune coming here could set everything I've done up in smoke. I'm trying to stop the plague completely, stop its spread utterly, but if Indune gets his grubby little monster fingers in this beautiful plan I've got cooking, everything could fall apart. Mina stared at him coldly. I know it's a hell of a lot to ask to get yourself involved with that guy, but this is very important, not just for the future of the continent, but the future of the world. Remember, there's a world-ending calamity coming, will kill us all, etc. Argrave rambled quickly. Please, Mina, I know you probably don't even like me that much, but I will definitely repay this favor. She blinked, and then turned her gaze away. All right, Mina said quietly. I'll do it. But this debt? There's going to be some heavy damned interest, you know. She pointed fiercely. Argrave clapped his hands together. You have no idea how relieving that is. Thank you, sincerely. Glimmen shifted on his feet, stepping up beside Argrave. He placed his hand on his shoulder and said in his low tone, someone's coming. Argrave shifted his head and turned on the dining table bench they sat on, looking to the sole entrance to this place. It's him, Glimmen said, eyes closed. Orion. Argrave's heart had a natural response, or panic. He looked around, feeling as though there was something he should hide, but nothing came to mind. Annalise dispelled her ward just as Prince Orion entered into the room. Brother, he called out. Finally found you, Orion, Argrave greeted, about to stand. Sit. Orion stopped him, walking up. Well, perhaps it is poor form of me to say so, considering I wish to speak with you elsewhere. Argrave stared up at him blankly from the bench. About the expedition, or Sylvic, or what? About you, your future, he said, tone low. Come, let's walk. He patted Argrave's shoulder. A growing nervousness swelled within, and Argrave touched Annalise's elbow. Annalise, he called out, attempting to bring her with him. Let us speak alone, brother. I have nothing against my beautiful sister-in-law to be, worry not, but I wish to speak with you alone. No one else will be there, not Magnus, not my guards, Orion amended. Argrave swallowed, then cast a glance at Annalise. Some nice time alone with his half-brother was the last thing he wanted. Nonetheless, Argrave stood, and he and Orion walked out of the room. Chapter 187, Bonds of Blood. To see the ever-diligent Orion neglect his perceived duty to the people was already disquieting enough. But the prince led Argrave further and further away from the camp, heading into the swamps. His only comfort was the knowledge that Orion wouldn't need seclusion to kill him. Argrave stayed quiet. He felt the need to say something, anything, but he was so off rhythm that he feared to bring up a topic that might cause an issue. They came to a great depression in the wetlands. At the center, many similarly shaped stones had been stacked in an orderly heap that marked it as man-made. Argrave recognized this place. It had been made by the swamp folk. It was a graveyard of sorts. Each stones marked the passing of one of theirs. Now, much of it had been grown over by moss or carried away by rains. Orion stepped ahead of Argrave and stopped. Argrave, do you have faith in the gods? Argrave digested Orion's question in an attempt to discern his purpose, yet he wasn't able to glean why Orion had brought him here with that question alone. I know that the gods are real, and that they affect this world, Argrave said truthfully. Orion nodded. Yet do 96 have potential beyond Veska, in your eyes? And be honest, sycophancy earns only my ire. Argrave stared at Orion seriously. Our gods can spread across all of Berenda if the right actions are taken, he said in all truthfulness. That was how it was in Heroes of Berenda, certainly. If the player sided with Orion in the Civil War, that fate was inevitable. Orion placed both of his hands behind his back and strode towards the stones in the depression ahead. Indeed, an apt way to put it. If the right actions are taken, the prince repeated. Argrave stepped a little closer after Orion, before the prince stopped and turned towards him. His eyes were closed as he spoke. Kriat, Achil, Ira, Tu'ur, Pilth, Gale, Razan, Welwyn, Malak, Zelam, Modder. Orion carried on and on, listing what Argrave knew to be all of the gods in the Vaska pantheon. Argrave could probably say what they governed if he had their names, but he certainly couldn't remember all of those names. After finishing his list, Orion opened his eyes and clenched his fist before him. Those I speak to, even though I bless them, heal them, as a proxy for the gods, the people. The people sing my praises. Prince Orion started to cry. His tears were molten silver, and when they hit the ground, the wetlands steamed. The people are ignorant of the true agent of their welfare. It makes me weep. He continued, choked up. I speak to the people. And though they name the common gods, though they pray to Gale for justice, few can name more than 5. He lifted his head up the sky. Then, I wonder why I heal them, Orion said, voice colder than the grave. The tears he'd shed rose from where they fell, re-entering his grey eyes as though erasing his sadness. They place only an idol of Gale in their house and pray for righteous justice to carry them through life. They forget all else yet have the gall to call themselves the faithful of Vaska. Such thoughts. Such impious thoughts. He shuddered terribly, and then knelt on the ground. Do you share them? He looked up at Argrave. Argrave looked down to Orion where he knelt and suggested, can people be blamed when they aren't taught? Orion stood and walked towards Argrave, looming above him. Precisely so, Orion agreed. And this is the issue I brought you here to discuss. The prince turned and walked back towards the ken. Argrave called out after him, you wanted to talk about educating the people? Orion didn't answer immediately. He stared at the pile of stones before him, kicking one away. He turned back slowly. One of my own royal knights called me a monster. Argrave raised a brow. Recently? No. Orion shook his head. When the plague first reared its head above the depths from whence it crawled, I expressed to my knights that they embrace the plague, that I would give them my blessing when the time came, and they would be all the stronger for it. Back then, they loathed me. Even the steadfast thought me distant, inhuman. Argrave listened patiently. I did not understand it, Orion continued, confounded. All royal knights swear an oath to live and die for the royal family, to shed blood for our sake, to obey our orders without question. And yet, when I expect they fulfill these vows, they deem me monster. Orion ground his foot into a large stone beneath, and it crumbled easily beneath his force. Would they swear an oath they do not intend to follow? Why would they speak lies so easily? For what purpose? Though the founder of House Vaska spoke lies freely, he never broke his vows. He never lied before the gods. So why? Orion cried out. Ask them, Argrave suggested. Orion turned his head. I have. They merely disavow their old selves, claiming they were fools and idiots to doubt me. He took a deep breath and exhaled, then shook his head. It is only my actions that earned me their loyalty. The oath they swore, the promises I gave. They were ineffectual. The prince placed his hand to his chest. I have never told another this, Argrave. But I know men fear me, loathe me. The people that come to this camp, they come with eyes squinted tight in suspicion, bodies braced to run in fear. It is only when I deliver them the blessing imparted to me that they bare their hearts to me, that they accept me well and truly. Argrave stepped a little closer. He didn't feel danger, but he did feel quite uncertain about where this was headed. The people that do love you more than anyone, it seems. They do, Orion nodded. No matter how much I tell them they should praise the gods before me. My own knights call me holiness, when that is not what I am. I'm a prince of Vaska, blessed by the gods. The gods, their power wells within me. And they whisper truths in my ear. What has come to pass? What will come to pass? Orion crouched down, then collapsed like a corpse onto the mud, staining the white robe he wore completely. I wish to help the people with these blessings, but I do not understand them. Despite my promises, they trust me only after I help. It makes things difficult. That might change as things move along, Argrave said, standing over Orion as he sunk into the mud. People will spread word of your good nature, your good deeds. That's what reputation is, you know. The prince turned until he was on his side, then lightly bashed the side of his head into the mud, dirtying his long black braid of hair. That is limited, he said sadly. He turned to his back, then stared up at Argrave with his grey eyes. Tell me, what gods do you invoke most often, Argrave? Argrave took a deep breath, conjuring his old favorites from Heroes of Berenda. I like Zelam, the god of magic. Tyrael, the goddess of wanderers. Orion smiled. Of course. Tyrael patronizes elves. Anri, goddess of blood. Argrave finished. The name was easiest to remember. It was important for the future. The prince amidst the mud stared at Argrave with blank expression, and for a few moments he worried he had misremembered something. Most I spoke to did not know those, Orion finally said. He started to cry again, and he wiped his face with muddy hands. Argrave stood around awkwardly as the giant man rolled about in the mud and wept. Suddenly, Orion leaned up, staring up at Argrave. You spoke to that crowd yesterday. All the faithful of Vaska, ostensibly. and yet with your words, you ease their suspicion of that heretical thing. That wetland spirit. I cannot say its name. Orion waved his hand away in dismissal. It was necessary. Argrave defended himself quietly. When I see something beyond I-96, spite and rage boil within me. The gods. They whisper in frenzy in my ears. Orion clenched his head as if remembering something. I am drawn to action as iron to a magnet. But you. The prince lifted his head slowly. You do not surrender to those impulses. Argrave swallowed, worried. I envy you, Orion finally said, abating some of his nervousness. He rose to his feet again. You possess that which I lack. Impulse control? Argrave questioned internally. You understand man, woman, even elves. Orion prodded Argrave's chest. Your words can sway them. Not action, speech, promises. Just as the founder of House Vaska. You have a lot of things I envy, Argrave said, hoping to change the conversation away from himself. Orion smiled. Then it is good to know I am not alone in my feelings. Orion looked back towards the ken. It is clear to me that this kingdom needs reform. Faith in the gods dwindles. Faith in the royal family has sunk even lower, Orion said, shaking his head in distress. I will not challenge Indune. By the grace of the gods, he is the divinely anointed heir. He looked to Argrave. But it is clear a monarch alone cannot satisfy the needs of the people. Argrave felt some goosebumps at Orion's words despite himself. He took a deep breath, then questioned, what do you mean? It was a pointless question, in part. He knew the answer. As you said earlier, the people cannot be blamed if they are not taught. And that is just it. Orion placed his hand on Argrave's shoulder and hunched down until their faces were level. He could smell his half-brother's breath. It was as sweet as a perfume, which only heightened Argrave's discomfort. All we have now are priests of Gale, acting as judges in cities, or mages who pray to Zelem seeking wisdom in magic. A few orders train priests that pray to Kraesh, seeking bountiful harvests, yet they are all scattered, disorganized, and few. No more than tiny droplets of coloring trying to change the hue of the ocean. There needs to be more. There needs to be structure, order, to our faith, Orion preached, squeezing Argrave's shoulder tighter. The people need to be educated in all aspects of our pantheon, of all the gods. That is what I must build. A hierarchy of the faithful, the devout, to read the scriptures, to preach to the masses. Orion stepped away, standing straight once more. He attempted to clean his white robes of mud without much success. Our great ancestor, Felipe I, took the house name of Vaska after his great serpent companion, Orion continued. He established this kingdom, which now spans so much of the known world. He has built the monarchy. It has prevailed for centuries. Now, I must found a second institution to keep this great faith alive. No, to expand it yet further. This was no shocking revelation to Argrave, but he had not expected Orion to ever share this with him. The man was ever impulsive, and it seems Argrave had made a good impression. That, coupled with sharing his blood, probably made the holy fool confide in him. Felipe I was powerful, true. But his true strength rested in his companion, the great serpent Vaska. Orion stepped forth. I thought myself the second coming of our founder, this entire time. I believe, now, I misinterpreted the whispers of the gods. Orion grasped Argrave with both hands. You must be a part of this with me, Argrave. You must take the role of Felipe I, while I assume the place of Vaska. What are you talking about? Argrave said in shock despite himself. Orion shook him a little. It is clear to me, and the gods whisper in my ear affirmation. You possess the elements closest to our founder, bravery, an iron will, and the pragmatism unique to humans. And best yet, the gift to bend them to your words alone. I envy that. I lack that. And as you say, you envy my qualities. Yet if we pool them, what are we, if not complete? We may form the foundation for our faith to tower above all others. Isn't it a bit too fast, to trust me with this bigger task? Argrave said quickly, panicking. I've been here only a few days, now. Orion stepped away, biting his gauntleted finger. Indeed. Perhaps I am being overeager. He stepped back to Argrave. But the changes you've displayed. You are so different from the skinny boy I once knew, bitter and angry and impious. And the gods that whisper to me, though I may misunderstand them, they never lie. I believe it has merit. You ought to give something like this time, Argrave said, trying to remain calm. And more importantly, we have to tackle this plague. Orion smiled, and stepped forth. That consideration of yours, it gives me hope my judgment in this is not wrong. But it is as you say. Orion grabbed him and pulled him into an embrace. I love you, brother. Argrave blanked when he heard those words. This was generally the part where you responded with the same phrase. He very slowly raised his arms up and returned the embrace, then said, me too, buddy, he finished. Orion didn't seem to mind. He pulled away, and said brightly, come. We must begin things. First of which is consorting with the heretical thing, once again, he said, voice grim. Argrave watched Prince Orion walk away, feeling like he'd just battled his most powerful opponent yet. Chapter 188, Intrepid Preparations. You come from Vaiden? Mina questioned Annalise, trying to start a conversation. Annalise stared out at the doorway which Argrave and Orion had left, nervously braiding and unbraiding portions of her long white hair. She answered Mina idly, "It depends on how you define come from." Mina placed her hands loudly on the dining table the two of them sat at. "You were born there." "I was born on a coastal village in Berenda." Annalise shook her head. Mina frowned, then tapped her fingers against the table for a time, staring at the white-haired elf. She bit at her lips in quiet deliberation, then questioned, "Why did your people invade Matoth?" Annalise was drawn away from her idle braiding and turned to face Mina completely. Though silent for a moment, she eventually answered simply, "They thought it their duty." "They?" Mina repeated. "I do not envision myself returning," Annalise replied. Mina tapped her fingers on the table once again, then questioned, "Who gave them this duty?" "Vade," Guilliman answered. Mina looked at him blankly, and so he elaborated, "Our goddess." Mina nodded, then placed her head on her arms on the table. "Of course. Naturally. There must be something higher than yourself giving you a reason to kill, elsewise people will have to confront their deeds. Better for some to die now to establish 1,000 years of prosperity." Guilliman disagreed at once. Annalise didn't seem to have any stake in the matter. She rose and exited, walking to where Argrave and his half-brother had left. "I don't see how it is all that different from what someone like Orion does," Mina spoke to Guilliman. Guilliman stared down at her coldly. He was easily twice her size. "This is a pointless conversation. I dislike that man more than anyone else here, I'm certain, but I put that aside. I just don't want Argrave to forget who he's helping," Mina said. "This place. These nights. It's safe, sure, so long as you don't step out of line." "I just..." She paused, then shook her head. "No matter." "It's not." Mina paused as two people walked through the door. Annalise and Argrave walked side by side and strode up to the table. "It seems it's time to get to work." Argrave clasped his hands together and rubbed them. "Orion wants to talk to Sylvic, meaning we're soon to start planning the expedition. A week, maybe a bit longer, and we'll leave camp. Going to be a bloody journey." Mina looked up at Argrave. "I'd best be going, then." Argrave lowered his head in a slight bow. "Once again, nothing but thanks from me, Mina." She stood up from the bench. "You'll pay me back in more than just words, I hope." "Risking life and limb for you." "Let's not forget who Indune is." Argrave's face grew serious. "I know the gravity of this." Mina kept her yellow eyes on his, then seemed to shudder from a chill. She walked away, preparing to head off. Despite Magna's first interference with the introduction to Sylvic to Orion, the promised proof offered to Orion was provided without issue. It was a simple thing for Sylvic to recreate the magic used to destroy the fortress. It had already been inscribed into the stone long ago. Sylvic activated her strange magic usable only by wetland spirits of her kind, and the stones began to emit a foul poison. Though Orion was enraged by this, it was proof sufficient for the holy fool that there was a conspiracy brewing in the wetlands. With that, Argrave, Orion, Annalise, Guilliman, and Sylvic occupied the holy fool's private quarters. There were several wax knights present as well, but they served merely as guards rather than participants in their meeting. Duran and Magnus were both absent. That was either a promising or an apocalyptic sign. A grand map of the wetlands had been arrayed atop the central table. Argrave moved it about with his fingers and said, "It can't have been easy to acquire this." "Indeed," Orion nodded. "The gods gave me a cartographer who once resided in this land in the form of a refugee. Once I spread the word maps when needed, this was delivered readily." Orion took a deep breath with a smile on his face, then exhaled. "Another sign the gods look upon this endeavor kindly." Argrave gazed at the map. It was far beyond what one might expect to see in a medieval period, though Argrave couldn't begin to guess how. He was sure magic had something to do in the map-making process. The borders of the wetlands were unclear, and the primary focus was the 8 fortresses that had once resided in this land. That was fine. That was all Argrave needed. "All right." Argrave hunched over. "The wetlands are very dangerous to traverse, especially with the waxpox writhing everywhere within. It's not just the environment. Foul beasts who can tear a man apart with these roam the swamps, and poisonous creatures abound." Argrave gestured towards the wetland spirit. "Sylvic can aid us in travel, but this is still enemy territory, and I do mean enemy. We'll be facing active opposition, hunted as intruders." Orion scratched at his beard as Argrave spoke. When another talked, his gaze jumped to them. "A small group of your best men would be ideal," Annalise noted. "It would facilitate ease of travel, ensure that gathering food is no great ordeal, and keep our movements relatively obfuscated." The prince gave slow nods that seemed more contemplative than anything. He looked at Argrave and questioned, "The enemy, what foul manner of beasts must be conquered?" "On the road? When we're on dry land, it'll be relatively safe." "I don't suspect we'll be on dry land often." "The greatest enemy will be the sentinels of the old wetland spirits. They're all manners of beasts, natural-born chimeras in part, but they're only in the deeper portions. Beyond that, there are manticores, black-snout alligators, rock-hide hippopotamuses." Argrave shook his head as he recalled the most obnoxious two of all. "There are leopards in the trees, they're poisonous, too. And gibbons, armed with weapons like Dresky had." "Dresky?" Orion tilted his head. "My child, whom you murdered in cold blood," Sylvic said. "I see," he nodded, unoffended by the accusation. "Yes, I recall. She broke my right gauntlet and my skin with one blow." "Powerful weapons, indeed," Orion noted. Argrave saw Gilliman give Orion a frigid glare, hand hovering near the two giant killers on his belt. Argrave fixed him with a stare of his own, calming his elven companion. "The wetlands are not so large." "How long you do believe this journey will take?" Orion questioned further. "Where is this so-called plague jester?" Argrave tapped his gloved finger against the fortress furthest from the one they were at. "It's here. But there's another factor. There are only a few safe places to shelter here. The wetlands, you try and sleep out in the middle of them, they'll swallow you whole," Argrave said seriously. "The only places vaguely hospitable are the abandoned fortresses, and even then, they're overrun by the nastiest of the jester's servants." Argrave stepped away from the map. "As such, we'll have to plan our route around them." Orion stepped forward and leaned over the table, planting his hands down. "Barring the one we reside in and the one this jester resides in. 6 fortresses. Will this take 6 days, then?" "No, that's not practical." Argrave shook his head. "We can cut across, skip some." With Sylvic scouting, the plan is 4 days. In truth, Annalise and Sylvic would be working in tandem. With Sylvic partly afflicted by the waxpox, her ability in the wetlands was greatly compromised. Annalise and her star sparrow would be doing the bulk of the work. It was paranoid, perhaps, but Argrave wanted to keep his cards close. Magic animals like the Brumacinas or the star sparrow could shrug off most of the effects from the wetlands. Then, 4 days of travel, during which we will be accosted by enemies, followed by a return trip with the same time frame? Orion questioned. "Yeah." "Frankly." Argrave paused, swallowing. "Frankly speaking, you're the only one who can handle a lot of the things in this place." "You and your Waxney, royal knights," Argrave corrected himself quickly. "You're the only one near a match for the plague jester." "Like the serpent Vasca for King Felipe I, you would have me act as your sword?" Orion smiled broadly. "I can and will fill this role. It brings me great pleasure to put an end to those who refuse to accept the gods of Vasca as their own." Argrave stayed silent, greatly disliking Orion's reference to Vasca and his pleasure at the death of heretics. "So, you'll get your men ready?" He finally broke his silence, staring at Orion with his golden eyes. Orion nodded. "I must put things in order here, gather rations suitable for the journey, and decide who among my knights is worthy of the honor of slaying the foul demon who ruins our beautiful land with unholy and unnatural rot." Orion stepped forth. "A week, by my estimates, the majority of which will be settling things at camp to sustain itself despite my absence. Please prepare you and your companions." Argrave sat upright in the bed. Annalise was already asleep. Her head rested against his leg. He stroked her long white hair idly, being sure not to get his fingers tangled and disturb her. He stared down at her with a distant gaze as he lost himself in thought. Orion's offer, Durin's actions, and Mina's task all occupied his mind, like a triumvirate of hellish problems solely designed to give him ulcers. He wondered if being black-blooded could stop that. Frustrated, he moved his head about searching for a distraction. There was only one in reach, a book with a white cover, denoting it as one of the books left behind by Garm. Argrave reached forward steadily, ensuring he was quiet and still, and took it in his hand. It was the B-rank spell, Bloodfud Bow. He kept that book by his side, always. He did not dare lose it. In the future, it would be one of the most valuable spells he had. Argrave opened it. The enchantments on each page lit up, all contributing to form a B-rank spell matrix in the air. It was only a whim at first, something, anything, to distract from the thoughts whirling through his head, but soon enough, Argrave found himself studying it in earnest. A fourth dimension to magic. If Argrave were to analogize his situation with something, it was as though he had stepped through a door into an unfamiliar part of the world. Though he was there, it had taken him a long time of looking around to understand the land. Even then, that was only surface level. He had to walk through this new land, observe things from different angles, and use all of the 5 senses to observe it in great detail. Argrave believed that he understood this analogous new land, that he understood C-rank magic, well enough. And now that he understood it, he had to learn how to make it move. Make it his. With the task viewed as a conquest, he felt that the moving matrix in the air had a whole different look to it. As the night passed by, Argrave was so consumed by his observation that he did not even notice he'd forgotten the problems that plagued him. He listened to Annalise's steady breathing, stared at the light before him, and passed the night in peace. Chapter 189, Prospecting. Though Durin had acted as though discovering Magnus' intentions would be a simple thing, he treated the matter very seriously. That might suggest it was not, in fact, a simple thing. Durin would probably agree with that assessment by this point. Durin had good reasons to do this. He hoped to earn trust in the group. Argrave never doubted Annalise or Guilliman, but he did think twice about anything Durin did or said. Beyond that, Durin wanted to follow any traces of Giractic Kiet beyond Argrave's mere insistence it was reality. And lastly, he did genuinely want to help. His first order of business in dealing with the hedonist prince was simple observation. Durin had hoped to catch Magnus doing something incriminating. He might have talked to shady people, delivered something, or left the camp in the dead of night, whereupon Durin would follow him and discover what, Exactly, the misfit prince was doing, trying to fit in. Something convenient like that was his first hope, even if far-fetched. Durin had some experience keeping watch on people in crowded places. He had done just that in Sethia alongside Bormusk in their plans for the retaking of the city. He made good use of the crowd. He could not deny it made him uncomfortable to weave so closely with the diseased, but he trusted Argrave enough to be content wearing his humorless mask and drinking the vile potions that boosted his immunity. Yet, after 3 days, Durin had no luck hoping for a convenience. All he learned was that Argrave was completely right about Magnus' character. That lent him confidence for his second idea. Magnus pushed open the flap and entered one of the tents for dining in the camp. "You're Magnus, right?" Argrave's brother. Durin called out, causing Magnus to pause and glance at him. The tattooed tribal sat on a table with a meal prepared. It was all meat, some of it seemed to be frog. The food was testament to the state of the camp. They relied on scavenged meat, mostly, with vegetables and all else being quite rare. Magnus had stopped when he was called, but he continued his steady walk into the dining tent in not a moment. "Prince Magnus," he corrected. "Right." Durin nodded slowly as the prince moved to the person handling the camp's food. With a slightly worn and stained wooden bowl in hand, he was served much the same of what Durin was eating. Magnus eyed the frog with some disdain. Though they were all but alone save the server, Magnus moved to a table quite far from Durin. Before he sat, Durin called out, "Argrave said he was the son of a king. He didn't mention he wasn't a prince." Magnus stopped, the disinterest on his face waning somewhat. He's changed his plan to sit far from Durin and stepped up right across from him. "And what are you?" Magnus asked him. "A mercenary from the burnt desert, formal tribal chieftain." Durin introduced himself, inflating his credentials deliberately. Magnus scrutinized him carefully. His eyes moved around his body, as though tracking something. Durin was well used to this gaze by now. Even the princes of these lands of wealth and green could not help but be intrigued by his golden tribal markings, it seemed. Magnus placed his plate down and straddled the bench, sitting across from Durin. "Bastards are born liars. It's a stain that affects their whole lives." Magnus poked at the frog with his finger. "Why Felipe didn't kill him in the crib like the rest, I'll never know." "Kill him in a crib? What had our bastard do to escape that fate?" Durin raised a brow. Magnus nodded, then continued emboldened after Durin mirrored his sentiments. "Plenty of other harlots had the good luck to catch my father's eye." The majority snuffed out. "Levin handles that duty now, from what I hear. Usually kills the mothers before they give birth, even." He grasped both of the frog's legs and tore it apart. "Good thing, too. It's like catching a fire just as it's starting, before the whole forest can burn down." Durin chewed on a piece of meat. "You mean there are others like him roaming about?" The prince nodded once again. "Some unknown, some unacknowledged." Argrave was the only base-born fostered at Derica, who was his mother. "That might be reason enough to keep him around," Durin questioned. Magnus waved a frog leg. "I don't know. Some dead whore. One of the few good things that Indian's done, killing her." Durin chuckled but kept his hands beneath the table to hide his clenched fists. The prince placed his elbows on the table. "Why do you follow him?" Magnus inquired. "Why else?" "Money." Durin emulated ripping coins together between his fingers. "He was traveling here to Berenda. I wanted to see the sights, eat rich foods, behold and hold beautiful things. And people," he said with a sly grin. Magnus didn't laugh, but Durin still thought his disposition changed positively. "And Argrave, how much does he pay you?" "This week all last. Keeps getting bigger the more I learn about this place. The more he comes to rely on me." Durin held his hands out, emulating a widening gap. "He's well off. Has those pink coins that glimmer, but he usually pays me in straight gold." Magnus' face darkened. "Rose gold magic coins," he concluded. "Probably from father." "Those are the ones." Durin nodded quickly. The prince gazed at the frog leg as if deliberating whether or not to eat it, then set it down with a grimace. He tapped his fingers against the plate as he stared at Durin. "So, you've come to me looking for someone to offer better future prospects? What, you've got something for me?" Durin smiled, then shook his head. "Not such a good look to abandon a contract so early. Unless things are different out here, and sellswords with poor reputation earn well." If Magnus was surprised, he didn't show it. He stopped tapping his plate. "Not such a bad play. If I were to guess, Argrave is here to suck on Orion's teat, help him with this plague, earn a reputation. He's hoping for legitimization, I'm sure." "My father might make such a thing happen." "Are you hoping for a boon from the king?" "Only reason I might picture you out in this hellish place." Magnus frowned. "You'd do better keeping more thoughts locked in your head and not spilling from your mouth," he cautioned Durin. Durin laughed, and the pair ate with a steady conversation going on. A great many knights filtered into a building that did not seem to fit the splendor of what they wore. Some knights were already present. They bore cold grey steel with a blue swordfish emblazoned on the breastplate. The knights that entered wore white plate with gold trim. The last to enter was the towering Margrave Reinhardt. There was a man sitting in the corner of the room. He seemed small amidst the crowd of brawny knights, but he was truly of average build. His wavy blue hair was kept well groomed and short, though the first grey hairs were settling in. A sharp beard and cutting pink eyes made him quite handsome, even despite his age. He wore fancy clothes with a swordfish sewn onto the shoulder. Most would recognize Duke Enrico of Montesai easily. Margrave Reinhardt stepped across the room, and Enrico rose to meet him. The two seemed at ease around each other, yet they were too serious to do anything more affectionate than a simple handshake. "If you come wearing armor, most people might think something heinous is to occur," Duke Enrico said. The Margrave said nothing, and after the handshake finished, sat at the table brusquely. Duke Enrico frowned. "What's wrong?" he questioned, sitting opposite the Margrave. Reinhardt's ruby eyes fixed on Enrico. "My son is ill." This accursed waxpox." Enrico straightened and took a deep breath. "He's being treated as best he can be in El Bril." "The fool refuses to return home," Reinhardt said angrily. "Says that he's still yet to deal with the riots, that he's making tremendous progress. It's abnormally aggressive, Helmut tells me. Already, it has spread from hand to elbow. If you need anything at all." Reinhardt stared off into the distance, gauntleted hand held up to his mouth. His gaze refocused and he shook his head. "No. Count Delbranov just called in a favor and has sent an A-rank mage specializing in healing." He turned his gaze to Enrico. "It's good to speak with you again. You leave your city less than twice a year, it seems, and I expected that number would be less so considering the war." Enrico smiled. "I only felt comfortable leaving because my daughter has been handling things more than competently." Reinhardt nodded. "You must be proud." "I am," Enrico confirmed. "On the topic of our families, you have my condolences for your brother." Reinhardt nodded. "Thank you. I'd prefer not to dwell on the subject." "Of course," Enrico nodded. "If we're not dwelling, perhaps we should get right to the point. I trust you gathered from my letters who I was suggesting we put at the head of our cause." "Argrave." Reinhardt nodded, planting his elbows on the table and wrapping one hand around a fist. Enrico judged his friend's reactions, then continued, "You may dislike him, but he's changed. He stole my mount, directly or indirectly, 3 times. Once, my prized warhorse. Second, when Elias pursued him. Third, when his tribal friend stole my wife not weeks ago." Reinhardt growled. Enrico frowned. "Argrave has your wife?" "No, Reinhardt paused, and then shook his head. "It's not important." Enrico pursed his lips, then shrugged before continuing. "I won't deny his deceitfulness. Nicoletta attests to his quick wit herself, and I've been subject to it once or twice. Considering his heritage, these might be considered good traits. The founder of House Vaska, the masterful schemer and monarch with his legion of 10,000 snakes." Enrico shook his head. "That isn't important. What Argrave's doing is." Reinhardt furrowed his brows, and Enrico gestured for his men to bring forth something. A knight stepped before the Margrave and unloaded a pile of books and scrolls tidily. Reinhardt kept his hands at his side, gaze jumping around uneasily. "Argrave informed my daughter of a calamity known as Gerektik Kiet." Enrico pointed with one hand. "Those books and scrolls are the best documents I have found on the subject. I have more, but they're in the carriage, and many are foreign, desperately in need of translation." Enrico tapped the top of a stack of books. "This book, here, contains my summary." Reinhardt reached for the books, then paused. "Just tell me." He shook his head. Enrico clicked his tongue. "My research leads me to believe Gerektik Kiet is real. It's been documented too much, too consistently, in other continents. The situations match extraordinarily well with what we're experiencing now. Mass discord, followed by a weakening of the barrier between planes, followed by a mobilization of harrowing forces, concluded by Gerektik Kiet's arrival, which threatens to tip the world itself into oblivion." Reinhardt frowned. "Something larger than everything is coming, old friend," Enrico said sternly. "And Argrave? Well, he's been burning himself at both ends trying to make sure the world is ready to handle it. I don't know how or why he learned of this, but when you examine his actions through that scope, they start to make sense." With those words, Reinhardt's hesitancy for the books vanished. He reached for them and began pouring through each as Duke Enrico waited in silence. Seconds turned into minutes as Reinhardt read, parsing through all that had been provided. Reinhardt closed shut Enrico's summative journal, the hardcover book letting out a glap. He set the book down, gaze complicated, and breathing uneven. "You think this is real?" Reinhardt questioned. "I do," Enrico answered. "And Argrave seeks to prepare the world to fight it? This is why he roams, putting an end to conflict?" The Margrave pressed. "Yes," came the answer. That fool." Reinhardt leaned in. "He's the person who'd step forward to do something like this. This is a man that's sorely needed to fix things before they fall to hell," Enrico said insistently. "He's young, he's brash, and he's uneducated in all matters but magic. I'm sure Felipe wouldn't waste tutors on him. He's a bastard. It will be difficult to gain support from the higher aristocrats, undoubtedly. Ideally, his betrayal with Nicoletta will abate much of that, coupled with his own positive reputation from his deeds. Nevertheless, there are no better options, Reinhardt." Enrico leaned back. Considering everything, he could be considered a blessing. The Margrave stared at Enrico. "He's betrothed to Nicoletta?" Enrico tilted his head. "There's been no ceremony. but he's expressed willingness to marry Nicoletta. Margrave Reinhardt put his hands together. He passed through the Lionson castle. He seems to have. Reinhardt trailed off. He has a partner, an elven woman, Snow Elf, and all I've seen tells me this is no whimsical affair. Already, they share a room. And he expressed he would surrender the betrothal for her. Enrico leaned back, pink eyes shaking. He opened his mouth, then shut it. Enrico rose to his feet, then stepped about the room. Gods be damned. The Duke cursed. Gods be. Enrico shook his head, running his fingers through his hair. Foolish boy. Foolish, foolish, foolish. Chapter 190, Lone Mourner. Argrave awoke strangely early in the morning. He was used to waking early, but never so early that the sunlight was not yet through the windows. He considered it might be because the expedition began tomorrow, some psychological nervousness causing him to sleep worse. As his brain gained clarity, he heard shouts. He lifted his head groggily, paying more attention, and the shouts continued. With that, he roused fully, turning his body and standing. Anneliese stirred due to his actions, and as he pulled on his boots and put on his duster to go see what was happening, she also moved into action without a word. Before a minute could pass, they were ready to go. Trailed by his Brimmersinners, they left their room in Orion's Keep, moving to see what was happening. Light was dim, and the sun still had perhaps 2 hours to appear over the horizon. It was sufficient to see without casting a spell, though. A large crowd of refugees murmured as 2 wax knights dragged someone to the keep. It took Argrave only a second to distinguish that it was Magnus. It took him seconds longer to distinguish that he was not resisting. Then, he placed it. The dead don't offer much resistance. The wax knights set down Magnus' body in the center of the square before Orion's Keep, and then one went off to fetch Orion. Argrave glanced around furiously, looking for Duran. He knew that the tribal had spent some time getting close to the man. Everyone in the camp did. In fact, if Duran had killed him, this was truly a disastrous thing. Having no luck in finding Duran, he stepped closer to the body. Argrave knelt down, examining it despite the stare of the crowd around. The cause of death was readily apparent. A knife of wood jutted out of the prince's neck. The handle was ebony, smooth and polished wood. It sprouted roots in the prince's neck, which seemed to be absorbing his blood. As his mind whirled, what little tiredness still remained vanished. Anneliese put her hand on Argrave's shoulder and pulled him away. He tightened his jaw. "Find Duran. I'll keep you safe while you look," he told her quietly. Anneliese nodded, and the star sparrow on her shoulder darted up and away into the air faster than the eye could track. He held onto her elbow, keeping her steady. As time passed, the whispers of the crowd continued, and Argrave's gaze stayed locked on the wooden dagger embedded in Magnus' throat. He wasn't torn up seeing the man dead, it just didn't feel real. A big hand on his shoulder drew him from his thoughts. Glimmen looked upon the scene, brows furrowed. "Where's Sylvik?" Argrave questioned at once. "In her spot." "Safe," he said, not sparing a glance at Argrave. "Get her," Argrave commanded. "Be careful." Glimmen nodded, then stepped away to where Sylvik was staying, far from the camp. After Glimmen had left, Argrave focused back on the scene before him. The star sparrow disturbed the air as it landed back on Anneliese's shoulder. She opened her eyes, inhaling deeply, then disclosed, "He was sleeping. I woke him, and he's on his way." Argrave furrowed his brows, then nodded. He briefly considered if it would be better if Duran was found sleeping, but Magnus seemed to have been dead for some time, so finding the tribal sleeping was not evidence he had nothing to do with this. "This is very bad," Argrave whispered to her. "Perhaps that was." "No, never mind." She shook her head. Argrave looked to her, about to ask what she intended to say, but she continued, "We would be best off focusing on how to solve this problem." Argrave agreed, turning his head away. Mid-turn, he spotted someone towering above the crowd, and his head whipped back. Orion stepped out of the keep, passing right by Argrave. He came to stand before Magnus' corpse. He stood there for a long, long while, as still as a pillar of stone. Then, slowly, Orion reached for the robe wrapped around his armor. He pulled apart a bit of the silken cloth, and it came free. He knelt down in the dirt, ever so carefully wrapping the silk around Magnus' body until he was but a bundle of white. Then, he scooped his arms underneath him and stood, holding Magnus in his arms as though he weighed nothing at all. Prince Orion looked more intimidating by tenfold standing there in his dark grey plate armor. His face was expressionless, and he held his dead brother with a delicacy far unlike his usual brutish displays of force. He stepped up to 2 of his wax knights, and commanded quietly, "Take him to my chambers and place him on the bed, that he might rest in peace." Orion held him out. "Send a rider out to Dirika, informing my father of what has happened here." His voice grew cold as he finished, "and ensure not a single soul leaves these wetlands." The 2 wax knights moved diligently to fulfill their master's command, one of them taking Prince Magnus' body in their arms and moving off to the keep. Orion stepped forward and shouted, "Who brought his body here?" "I did, Your Holiness." One of the wax knights stepped forward and kneeled. Orion grabbed his neck and pulled him up like he was a bag of cloth and not flesh and blood. "You drag him before a crowd of onlookers, humiliating the family. You take him from the side where it occurred, that any and all evidence is yet more obfuscated. Why? What were you thinking? Were you thinking? Are you responsible? The knight sputtered for air as Orion's gauntleted hands dug into his flesh, drawing blood. Argrave shouted, Orion, you'll kill him. Orion threw the wax knight, and the man flew 10 feet before collapsing like a doll. He grasped at his throat, yet the breath still did not come. Durin had appeared just in time to witness this scene, and he took a cautious step back. Argrave glared at him, 1,000 questions running through his head. He saw only shock and surprise on the tribal's face. His windpipe is probably collapsed, Argrave shouted as he moved towards the enraged Orion. Any mage, tend to him, he commanded, and some people moved to obey. As he neared Orion, the giant of a man staggered towards him, making Argrave's heart skip a beat. Orion latched onto him, weeping into his shoulder. Argrave was sorely pressed to support the weight of him, back arching. Our brother! He cried. Our brother is gone. Argrave said nothing, feeling a headache sprout in his head as fast as it ever had. His brain was scrambling to figure out how to deal with this situation. Your Holiness, I would not embrace that one so readily. Just as quickly as it had fallen upon him, Argrave was relieved of the burden. Orion strode up to the person who had spoken, another wax knight, and grasped his gorget, shaking the man. What do you speak of? That man is my brother. Orion shouted down at his subordinate. The company he keeps, the knight continued, undaunted. That tribal began hovering near Magnus at all times, not days before this occurs. Orion's hostility ceased, and he released the knight's gorget. His head turned to Durin, who stood just behind Annalise. He took steady, heavy steps towards him, and Annalise stepped aside in fear. Argrave moved, holding his hands out to stay Orion ineffectually. The prince pushed past him, coming to stand before Durin. Glimmin returned, bringing along Sylvic. The wax knight stepped up behind Orion, continuing, the weapon used to slay Magnus was made of wood, just as that foul and unholy wetland spirit, he pointed. Some of your knights and I were both guarding Sylvic. Nothing occurred last night, Glimmin contributed at once, voice low and guttural so as to cow the crowd. Orion stared down at Durin, grey eyes frigid and stony. Durin seemed the size of a child before the gargantuan prince, and though the man boldly held his gaze, his nervousness shone through. Your Holiness, all due respect, but who can say what that creature is capable of? Another wax knight contributed. It's a foul and unholy being and demonstrated clearly it's capable of casting fell magic. The weapon, Orion's chambers. They're a mess of evil magics that surely share this wetland spirit's origins. Orion, I can assure you that this is not something Sylvic is responsible for. Argrave placed his hand to Orion's chest, attempting to place himself between Durin and the prince without success. A refugee contributed. The tribals don't share our gods, Your Holiness. What's more, that man hovered near Magnus day in and day out before the attack, as sycophantic as they come. Orion stared down at Durin, his breathing deep and powerful. Durin fearlessly said, I had nothing to do with this. The spirit has motive, the first wax knight noted. You killed its underling, that foul heretic that struck you, Your Holiness. Orion's gaze jumped to Sylvic, and Argrave said in panic, don't do anything hasty, Orion. Take time to think this through. Durin's like family to me, and I'll never forgive you if you do something to him, he threatened. We need Sylvic to traverse the wetlands. Let's calm down, think rationally. The prince stared at Sylvic, wrath brewing in his eyes, before he turned his head back to Durin, who still stood boldly before him. Do you believe in the gods of Vaska? Orion questioned. Of course I do, Durin answered at once. Orion reached a hand up and placed it on Durin's shoulder. The prince's hand was bigger than his head. We shall see, he said, pulling Durin forward. Men, keep watch on the heretical spirit. Prince Orion walked away, pulling Durin along. Though the tribal resisted, it meant little before Orion's might, and the best he could do was avoid falling. Orion, Argrave called out, stepping after him. I meant what I said. What are you going to do? Orion said nothing, leading Durin into the keep. Orion, Argrave continued to shout, trailing after him. Orion. Yet no answer came, and Prince Orion led Durin into the keep, heading for a place Argrave could not begin to guess. If you like this audiobook, subscribe the channel for more videos like this. And join my Patreon if you want to support me, where you can find the complete collection Jackal Among Snakes audiobooks. Hurry up, what are you waiting for? Leave some comment and let me know if you guys like this story, or you have a web novel you like and want to hear its audiobook. I will be happy to create them for you. Please like, share, and leave a comment on the video.